Hi, this is Paul, and some of you might recognize who's with me. She's been sort of around this little corner of the internet a little bit, and actually, I got a John Vervaeke contacted me and connected the two of us. So this is Esther Meeks, and you are not unfamiliar to me because Karen Wong has spoken of you, and I think you've been on Karen's channel and John Vervaeke. So why don't you give a little introduction to yourself? And then I don't know if you've watched much of my channel at all, have you?
Well, I poked around to get to know you today, and I saw that you had lots of wonderful conversations there.
We
So,
major in conversation, so we're going to get into your story and then we'll get into your book. So that's what we'll do. So does that sound good?
well, it's wonderful. It's great to make your acquaintance. I think another name is John Lumgare,
Oh yeah,
who
yeah.
I met in England when I
Yes.
spoke at Touchmoot. So he's the one that said you need to get in touch with my friend Paul.
Yeah, he's been one of my UK promoters whenever I go there. He sort of takes care of me. He and another guy, Tayo, in the corner, they sort of manage me whenever I wind up in the UK for one reason or another. So he's been a big follower of this. Well, let's now obviously some people will know you because of your academic work, and we will talk about your book. But let's first get to know you. Tell me about the
Yeah.
home you grew up in.
Well, first of all, can I just say there's only one Meek, meaning there's no S on the end of my last
Oh, I'm
name.
sorry, because I have a woman, actually, a woman in our church, Corinne Meeks, who's also
Yeah.
Elsie Meeks, and she's just over there in the coffee break room. So that's part of the reason I've
Oh,
sort of programmed. So Meek. All right, I will try to remember that.
yeah. Well, you asked about the home I grew up in.
Yeah.
Bible believing, uh, uh, and everybody's still in church doing
Wow.
things. So they're either
Good.
preaching or playing or singing. And
What
for
corner of the church in the United States, just judging by your accent?
Well, I was born in Philadelphia.
Oh, okay.
And I was in a Baptist church that actually has been the first Baptist church of Philly, and
Okay.
but we were really under the vision of what was then Philadelphia College of Bible, and so we were all dispensationalists and Schofield Bible toting, memorizing people.
Oh, interesting. Dispensationalist. Well, this is sort of this is gonna be interesting.
Well,
So,
I grew up and became a Presbyterian, and now
oh,
I've come to the liturgical side of things. So
oh,
it's been a and this I have to say I just went to England, particularly to Oxford in May, and I do feel as if my time there really connected the disparate um, forms of spirituality in my life. It was really quite something. I appreciated that.
what did your father do for work?
At the point that I was born, he worked for a refinery that made gasoline. That was a job he got because he was a little too old to go off to World War II.
Okay.
So I always, I felt the smell of gasoline was, my protection in life.
So your father was not an academic.
No, the only book he knew was the Bible. I think that and his chemical handbook. But
Okay.
now my mom, on
So,
the other hand, also he all my life she was a Bible teacher
oh,
and reader and writer, and yeah, that was the life that I knew.
so did you go to public school or Christian
I
school?
did, yeah. Went to public school, and then my I started off in chemistry, and uh, my philosophy story typically starts with my 13-year-old puzzlements about whether how could I know that God exists and could I know that anything outside my mind exists. I mean, that was the more fundamental problem as far as I was concerned. And uh, I reading Francis Schaeffer in high school, which I did because my mother read all the first books that came into the bookstore that she was working in at that time. I realized my problems were philosophical. But then, after I had started off into college, I found out that you could study philosophy. And it took me 12 hours to change my life because it
Really?
just seemed like I was morally obligated to do it because these were the most important questions. I was sure I wasn't smart enough, but I just felt obligated. So off I went, and that was the moment, a span of 12 hours.
Where
And
did you go to college?
well, I started at Lebanon Valley, and then because I was hearing from a student of Jim Greer's at Cedarville College about his, it was painting glowing pictures of his philosophy classes. That was my decision. My decision was sight unseen to go study with this man.
Oh,
So I transferred to Cedarville College.
where is Cedarville College?
It is in Cedarville, Ohio, which is near Springfield, Ohio, which has been in the news recently, near Dayton. It was we got hit in the 1974 Xenia tornado, if you happen to remember that. I was there.
Wow. Well, tornadoes, knowing a tornado in real life is very different than knowing the word tornado and knowing that it's a swirling amount of
Right,
air.
right. I
Um,
understand. I have repeated experiences living in St. Louis.
so, was Cedarville College a Christian college?
Well, what's more, it was Baptist, but
Okay.
I like I said, I grew up kind of in the shadow of Philadelphia College of Bible. So the particular Baptist association that our church happened to be a part of was not kind of the main formative influence in the church that I grew up in.
Okay.
So, but I did learn some things that I didn't know
Well, that's
at
good. You kind of want that from college.
and which played out in my moving on, I think.
Well, American evangelicalism tends to have a reputation for anti-intellectualism.
Yeah,
Was that a strain in your life at all in terms of becoming an academic?
I think, quite honestly, I have had such a low confidence in myself
Hmm.
that I didn't realize that the problem was anything other than myself, and I thought it was sin. So, and I just I didn't. I guess it was just, I don't know. Maybe this I was too interior. It was all about me, and then uh, although quite honestly, to this day, I've spent my life not telling people what I've been thinking about because they had no clue. And that started with my parents. And so that's probably one of the reasons why I have this agenda to try to render philosophy for all of us, right?
Oh, well, now
But
this
but
is
it,
getting
it
interesting.
never I snobbery, at least in the typical form, hasn't been a motivation for me. Quest has been the upper my personal philosophical quest. That's what it's been about.
Well,
Still is.
right from the start here, I don't think anybody would have had an inclination that you were a snob, that I mean, we've all
Good.
sort of met snobs and we sort of kind of have an understanding how that goes.
Eschew that stereotype.
Well, maybe I should give you a little bit of background because so that you know exactly the kind of people who are going to be listening to this video because hmm, let me give you a little bit of background. So I am a Christian Reformed minister, the Christian Reformed Church. You've heard of the Christian Reformed Church.
Yeah.
Um,
This is a seminar at Calvin in June.
okay, good. So that's the tribe I come out of, and I'm a third generation Christian Reformed minister. My grandfather had churches sort of on the plains, one in Canada and some on the East Coast. My father had most of his ministry in a little racial reconciliation church in Paterson, New Jersey. I was a
Mhm.
foreign missionary, and then I came to a little multi-everything church in Sacramento, California, and spent 20 years just sort of shepherding this group. And about 7 years ago, um, I was watching what was going on around Tim Keller, not Tim Keller, around Jordan Peterson, and thought this is interesting, but really had difficulty finding people to talk about it with. And so I thought I'd play
Okay.
with YouTube.
Yeah. Okay.
And that started something. And Jordan Peterson, by that point, was already well on his way to where he's at right now. But along the way, I became friends with Jonathan Peugeot and John Vervaeke, both of whom were already sort of in his circles. And then the three of us began to talk about a bunch of different things, and we were then on YouTube. And so John has continued to develop his Vervaeke Foundation and his Silk Road, Philosophical Silk Road. He's been doing that thing. Jonathan Peugeot has been developing the symbolic world, but I've sort of been doing what a pastor does, which is kind of bringing people together. And a lot of the people that we have brought together very much are not snobs. Some of them would like to be snobs and they try to act like it, but they're not fooling anyone. Most of the rest of us very much kind of embody what you just described, in that we've got ideas about the world and we like to talk about the world, and we really don't want to have all of the usual things get in the way of us talking about the world.
Mm.
And so Karen Wong in many ways is very emblematic of that. Karen, of course, has had a whole bunch of vocations during her lifetime, and then she's an artist, and then she found Peterson, then she found me. She's in the Bay Area, not too far away. And so then we began a friendship, and she asked me what she should do. I said, well, start a YouTube channel and talk to people. But because I'm a pastor, I can talk to the camera pretty comfortably, but she that didn't feel right. So she just kept bringing in different people for conversation, because she too is sort of compiling her view of the world. And what we sort of have, what we affectionately call this little corner of the internet, has become both an online and an in real life community of people talking about how they see the world, whether or not anybody with much earthly status cares. And so there's also
That's
been a go ahead.
I just said that's lovely.
Yeah,
Sounds
and it's been
wonderful.
lovely. And there's also on the church side of things an initiative of mine that I call Estuary,
Mm.
which is a so I was pastor of this church for 20 years, and it's a church in a rough area of town. And my father's church was too, so I'm very used to that. So I deal with homeless people and all kinds of different characters. And a lot of people coming to my door looking for $20 for gas or help with the electric bill or something like that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I was always frustrated because here we're a church, and while we certainly are in the business of helping the poor, which we do a lot of, what churches really like to do is we like to talk about Jesus, we like to talk about God, but for many people, Jesus and God are parts of big conversations, very much as 13-year old you bumped into, which is Jesus and God come in a context. And of course, for many of us, that context is found in the Bible and the church. And then there's this weird parallel track that you might call philosophy, about asking big questions of the world. And I was very frustrated that because I'm a pastor, a lot of people, once they find out I'm a pastor, they don't really want to talk to me because they're expecting some hard sell into a church, which is going to take a lot of their time and money. And they're not interested in that. But I always felt that the church was a great place for opening up a lot of conversations for people, whether or not they believed in God, whether or not they believed in Christianity, whether or not they believed in whatever, but just a place for big conversations. And so it was actually sort of out of what had launched in YouTube that I started
Yeah.
church adjacent groups that I call Estuary, where we have people who
Mm.
are Christians, people who are not Christians, but people who want to have about a 2 hour conversation of whatever they think is interesting, meaningful, or important. And
Yeah. Yeah.
so we've been starting those groups all around the world now. And
Wonderful.
and we find that churches are sort of good places to do that. And I think in some ways partly because I don't think this is as true for Christian universities, but it's definitely true for secular universities, that the social, political, culture war stuff has gotten so combative. It's increasingly difficult to have an open conversation amongst people that disagree in all sorts of ways without everything somehow devolving into some uninteresting binary conversation about politics. So,
Right. Yeah. Well, I would say my piece of that, and thank you so much for telling me that. And that's just so cool. And that corner of the internet is just a remarkable thing. I think COVID enhanced that, and I noticed that. You're absolutely right on about church, but I think it's significant that what you've created is estuaries, and also, you've got this YouTube estuary,
yes.
and my experience has also had me kind of flying under certain sorts of radar.
Yep.
But my particular issue really was, how do we know? And so, and my particular shtick, I think, is helping everybody uh, to see how knowing actually works. I think that my belief is that the proposals about knowing that I've been blessed to garner will make you better at whatever your job is. And oh, by the way, it'll also make you better at knowing God. So, I've developed ideas about how I think knowing works, and I feel, I'm not particularly politically involved, inclined, that sort of thing, but I do think that one of the issues with the evangelical tradition to this day, in some form or other, is epistemology.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm sure Leslie Newbegin's work, but
Yep.
I feel like he threw down a gauntlet that I picked up, which is, you got to do some sort of pre-evangelistic epistemology, because presume we've got these implicit skewed presumptions that we kind of imbibed from modernity, that's gumming up the works of all corners of our life. And before we can even talk about like faith and art or whatever, we've got to fix knowing. So I feel about myself, I'll never run out of a job.
No, that is true.
Because it always is there. But the thing is, I'm humbled to say, is it's not a 10-minute fix,
No,
right?
no.
And so I've written pages and pages and pages, and I'm still trying to say it. And
Well, this is not a small book.
right. I know.
Now,
Uh,
let's because one of the things that immediately jumps out when I look at your book is we have difficulties with the word, and we're with the word knowing, because that word has a meaning which everyone assumes today. It's contextual, but what you mean by knowing, it was a so I had mentioned that before. I was a foreign missionary, and I was a missionary in a Spanish language country. And of course, many languages have different words for this one word that we have in English. In Spanish, it's saber and conocer. And often in English, people sort of are stuck with saber, which is this propositional knowing. Of course, John Vervaeke stuff is all tied into this as well. Propositional knowing, but conocer is really the other three P's that Vervaeke has.
hmm,
And right there in the structure of the language, then you have a sense of, yes, that there are different kinds of knowledge. And also, to a degree, if you were raised in a church and you, let's say, had the King James or even the RSV, and you would read along as a little kid and hear that Adam knew his wife and Seth, and then suddenly, when you're a little kid, you read that and it's like, how did they use that word? How did they use that word? And so then there's all these little jokes about knowing biblically, et cetera, et cetera. So let me ask you this. When was the first time you had a sense of there was an issue with our assumptions about this word to know, and what provoked that?
Ooh, that's a fantastic question. I'm not sure I can answer it. Uh,
Something obviously put you on a path here.
well, the questions put me on a path. The point at which I realized that they both had to do with knowing,
Hmm.
I'm not sure. I mean, so much of my story I've written in the last 20 years, So, I've had and I keep having realizations that are kind of retroactive.
Yeah,
It's not,
the
and
past
that's
is a
not,
very funny thing. It's not
it
quite as set
is.
as people
It's not
imagine.
even past, as somebody said, Faulkner or somebody like that. But I in writing Doorway to Artistry last year, the last couple of years, I realized that I had been styling myself as a baby skeptic. But what I was an adolescent onset skeptic, which freed me up to write now about I'm calling us to return to a metaphysics of childhood. That's one of my I love inventing terminology. But a key moment for me came in finding the work of Michael Polanyi.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And as I read his work, I said, "Oh, I said this is making sense of my faith." And not only my faith, it's making sense of everything. Because it's like it's a big trump card. It's like this, you can't help it. This is how you go about knowing. And he was writing as a premier scientific discoverer. And I was the one who was a skeptic. And so in particular, the thing that just I still get chills as I think of it was his frequent aside that says, "Oh, by the way, here's how you know you've made contact with reality," which is what I was longing for. And what he said is, you know, you've made contact with reality when you have this unspecifiable sense of indeterminate future prospects. Well, who even talks like that? There is no in the world that even raises the question. Well, there's one now. I'm a fangirl of DC Schindler, but who talks about contact with reality. But but to talk about indeterminate future prospects, actually Rowan Williams does this too in his book Faith and Art, which I've tapped deeply in the artistry book. But that sense of possibilities, and you may have realized already, or if not, as you get to know me, you'll be sure of this. I'm a very excitable person.
That's good.
And I managed to write a dissertation in writing on contact with reality on excitement because as an epistemic signifier, that you're getting onto something, reality's about to break in, or has broken in and caught you up in this exuberant party. That's my idea of philosophy right there.
Well, I don't think this is different from, I mean, we started talking about snobbery and status, and one of my favorite little sayings is hierarchies bind and blind. Because
Hmm.
to a certain degree, when you get up into a hierarchy high enough, that hierarchy holds you. And it was on Chad the alcoholic, who you understandably might not know who he is. He wears a lucha libre mask on YouTube often, but he's now Chad the girl dad because his wife is pregnant. But he made a comment the other day that was very Polanyi-ish when he commented that many of the real breakthroughs that have come up in human civilization often come up cross hierarchy or cross silo, I'd say. And of course, Polanyi was one
Yeah,
of those.
integration.
And 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 I think part of that is because you tell me what you think about this. Disciplines, by virtue of how they work, especially in this culture where we have some really we have some strong controls on knowing, prevent a lot of
Hmm.
knowing in that way.
Yeah, I'd say that's epistemological. It's expertise,
Yes,
is kind of this anal uh well, I'm not going to tell you what my colleague used to describe it, but it's just kind of this anal. You're condemned to get more and more and more focused, and
right,
you're inherently threatened by any sort of synthetic whatever.
right,
And actually, I think the beauty, one of the many myriads of beauties of Polanyi's subsidiary focal integration is it shows, and this is the flaw in modernist epistemology is we all presume knowledge is focal, that you focus on it. But he said no. For it to sing, you got to put it at the subsidiary. So if you took experts, quote unquote, and put them as subsidiaries to the larger vision of whatever your university, or in your case your corner of the internet, and that sort of a thing, if you put the people at the subsidiary and together, you can invite this transformative vision. That's how you navigate forward. And then those transformations, those integrations, it kind of in reverse uh, catch things up as parts in a whole,
right.
right? So for Polanyi, it's always kind of this lurching backward, you know, break in of insight from beyond that then catches everything up in it. And that's the healing. I would use the word perichoretic dynamic of good knowing. And I argue that we all know that if we can ride a bike, if we can play football, if we can make an omelet, if we can garden, it's everywhere. You can't deny it. So I tend to start with people with on bicycles and talk
Oh,
about that for a really long time,
right. Or
And then,
swimming.
yeah,
Again, a lot of this procedural, again, Vervaeke has this four P's. A lot of this procedural, participatory, a lot of this kind of knowing. But again, knowing has been siloed into, Ian McGilchrist, of course, just jumps to mind in this, gets into this particular left brain, emissary brain, where the great value is, and I think you said it well, sort of continuing to sort of auger down into something. It's sort of the endless reciprocal narrowing of Amazon boxes. They just get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And we send people up the PhD hierarchies when they just get smaller and smaller and smaller and
yeah,
smaller.
yeah. And Polanyi talked a whole lot about the healthy dynamics of this in personal knowledge in a part that I hardly even tap. But he just thought, look, this kind of flowing conviviality among scientists and community. That's a good thing. By the way, in Loving to Know, what I'm trying to argue is from the aha moment of in breaking insight of the integration to say that's a little person like.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah,
so
yeah.
so when I have a breakthrough and I figure it out, like oh, my rose bush isn't in need of water, it's got a disease, right? Or something like that. When I have that kind of a breakthrough, there's a moment when I'm kind of seeing eye to eye in, as Buber called it, I thou encounter.
Right.
And so the moment of discovery is that kind of face to face encounter.
Yeah.
So the whole structure of Loving to Know is my proposing that the paradigm of best acts of knowing should be the interpersonal, covenantally constituted relationship, actually best typified by Jesus showing up and redeeming us, which is like life transforming. And then, what happens is that encounter then issues in perichoretic intimacy and communion. I mean, you're just never done with a garden. And that's the joy of it. It's this unfolding dance over every season. So
Now,
that's knowing.
so, oh boy. So you said, so we can get into the question of what a person is, because we tend to in this Gilchristian Emersarian brain thing, when we imagine that a person is wrapped in skin and has 10 fingers and toes, um, when in fact, what words to use, what a well-adjusted, or what a whole or good person is actually the integral knowing of all sorts of subpersonalities and narratives into one body. I'll say it that way. Where, I mean, when I so as a pastor, I'm always working on two levels. I'm always working on one hand, helping individual people like us that have names and histories and stories, but we have all of these. We had moms and dads and brothers and sisters and teachers and friends and people on media and screens and things, all sort of integrating into one person, to have that be a good person, a God honoring person, I mean, we could put all these different valences on it. But then as a pastor, we're also trying to take all of these people and we are trying to assemble them also into, in some ways, a person, but it's a multi-people person or a body. And of course, in Christianity, this gets assembled into the body of Christ. And of course, all of that isn't. And it seems to me that what you're trying to put forward in terms of knowing both gets at what I try to do as a pastor with individuals and what I try to do with a pastor as a body of Christ. Because this is actually very estuary. This is very much a reason behind my estuary project. Because what I think, where I think the church has been deformed by this malady of knowing that you are pointing out, is exactly in this area. Because what I find, what you need to actually have a thriving body of Christ is a whole lot of the kind of knowing that you keep pointing to between the people. And what I see even in an individual is that all of the threads within them need to be knowing each other and the kind of knowing you keep talking about for that individual to thrive. Now, as what I said made any sense at all to you?
Well, thank you for it. And let me see what I can do with it. I do like the model of subsidiary focal integration, which what Polanyi says is in any act of coming to know, you're relying on clues to shape or focus on a pattern that we then submit to as a token of reality. And in that, there's this from to structure. So the things that we're relying on, and then the focal coherent pattern that's actually irreducible to the subsidiaries as a whole would be irreducible to the parts. But one of the cool things about subsidiary focal integration, and this is where I'm starting and connecting with what you're saying, is it if you've got a dynamic subsidiary focal integrative whole, let's say bike riding, or let's say something I've never done, surfing, right? You've got this subsidiary artful dance going on. And so what Polanyi was so intrigued by, for example, would be the fact that our two lines of sight contradict each other focally.
Yep.
But if you put them at the subsidiary, you've got 3D.
Yep.
Right? So when you've gotten to the integrative whole, then that actually frees things up that you had been fixated on to be able to dance,
Right.
right? And a great example would be jazz ensemble. And I would think that's a little what I'm hearing you describe in your estuary and what you think a church ought to be.
Right.
So in Loving to Know, I have this whole big long section called interpersonhood. And really what I'm trying to argue is that the knower as well as the yet to be known, ought to be seen as person-like.
Yes.
And then the venture of coming to know ought to be seen as some kind of uh, inviting of a person-like reality
Yes.
into encounter and communion. And then what you've got is this lovely dancing freeing up, which I think is what Polanyi was saying with conviviality. You've got this shared love of science because you love reality, and then you're just having so much fun, connecting with each other, at least for him. I mean, of course, he was like way up there, in conversation with the greats. So it was very lively for him. But that, I think, I would say that subsidiary focal integrative dynamic would also is a healthy one, and it is church like.
Yes.
You would like your church to be like that,
Yes.
and obviously that all the things that the Bible says about the body of Christ, you know. And it seems to me, as a Christian believer navigating, like Oxford, like what, it seems that it's, and actually I argue this in a texture in Loving to Know, is uh, this subsidiary focal integrative structure allows you to be irenic.
Yes.
So if you're not fixated on this exactitude as opposed to this exactitude,
Yep.
but somehow you've got a larger vision of, let's say, loving Jesus,
Yep.
or the same with reading scripture, then it's the focus on the inviting the larger pattern, which is going to break in graciously and catch us all up in it, right? I don't know if you would ever have heard of this book, but I commend it to you, especially as a pastor. David Kettle, who was successor to Leslie Newbigin in the Gospel in Our Culture Network. And
Huh.
this book is called Western Culture in Gospel Context. Now, doesn't that sound like Newbigin?
Yes, it
And,
does.
and it's toward the conversion of the West. And he too uh, taps deeply into Michael Polanyi. And for him, subsidiary focal integration becomes essentially the lively dynamic of conversion. And he defines the gospel as the approach of the integrative pattern of the hospitality of God. It's fantastic. It's a fantastic book, but it's very dense, but it's like you could have a philosophy of ministry for your whole church for 10 years out of that book, because he's got 10 conversions he talks about. So, but anyway, how am I doing in
No, that's
connecting?
great. That's great.
What?
My my big question, that's not really a question, but how can I say this? Well, I'll just bring it back to Jesus because Jesus is sort of an interesting entree into this. If you think about, we'll use atonement. If you think about the atoning mission of Christ, if you ask someone who's been through basic Protestant catechism, what is atonement? It is at one meant, and what Christ accomplishes is the reconciliation between ourselves and God. That's in the individual, the creation and God. It's the redemption of heaven and earth. I mean, we've all these theological ways of saying this, and I would see. I very much see your mission in that way because the quest, it seems to me, of epistemology is to know and be known, to love and be loved. And I very much like how you framed that the best approach to actually dealing with knowing is in fact personal. And I think covenantal is the right word for that. But I think a lot of people, that word covenant, they're not quite, they think covenant means contractual, whereas covenant is quite a bit broader than merely contractual. But So that then is the goal. The goal is the redemption, is the restoration of the connection between heaven and earth. Jesus, of course, praised that in thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, the reunion of heaven and earth. The curious thing, and so we might say that Jesus was the best knower. And I really want to agree strongly with you with respect to that it's a personal way of knowing that that is in fact the right mode. A long time ago, I bumped into Pascal. Pascal had sort of these two ways of approaching the world, and one was the spirit of geometry and the spirit of finesse. And I think those very much map onto McGilchrist's Master and Emissary, because the spirit of geometry has its place to, to drill down and disciplined refinement to, and the fact that creation affords that sort of drilling down, I think, is a tell of its design and its beauty. But one of the things that I noticed is that for the most part, the spirit of finesse is really what you need to approach the world. And the spirit of finesse is really what you need to approach another human being. Jordan Peterson often talks about the fact that if you sort of reduce a person into, let's say, one of simply mechanistic patterns, a person will become very insulted. They'll become very upset because they'll basically say, even someone who likes to walk around imagining that the world is really just simply a series of highly complex billiard ball interactions, even that person will become very upset if you look at him and say, well, I know psychology and sociology and all of these, and so I can simply reduce you to math. And people are very offended by this, even those that say people are reducible to math. And so Pascal argues, this the language he has of the spirit of finesse is in fact interpersonal mode of relationality and knowing. And the thing that I couldn't stop thinking about as I look over your work is that of mode, because I very much understand. No, you're a philosopher, so you're doing the work of philosophy. The work of philosophy is to make arguments and to explain it in something like this. And as a pastor, when I look at Jesus, it's so interesting that Jesus doesn't write a book. Now, obviously, people around Jesus and those who were listening to those who had been around Jesus, they start writing books, and we have those books among us. But, part of why I have sort of, Jonathan Peugeot has sort of worked on art, John Vervaeke has worked on cognitive science and philosophy and those things. Part of the reason I've devoted myself to working with people is that I think Jesus' method of changing the world now obviously also his patience, because one might argue, well, depending on how you define a world, one would argue that Jesus' plan didn't really get global traction until a couple hundred years later, when suddenly important people in the hierarchies begin to notice that there's this weird group that keeps growing, and then of course it takes over, but that then sets up more processes. So why philosophy in this? Was philosophy just the place that finally you found something that fit into this calling and this mission that you had? Because it's really interesting, because in my experience, with the exception of people like Polanyi and yourself, a lot of philosophers don't seem to know a lot about knowing.
And oh my gosh, yeah, yeah. I have to say, I was in this for myself.
Good.
And I needed the answers to my questions. And what I've come up with is not, I've taught history of philosophy. I I've got philosophical information, but that's not my gift to give other people. And it's not that I'm a philosopher. Oh, I am a philosopher, and I went at this philosophically, but uh, I have, like I said in the intro, I've kind of left the ivory tower
Yeah.
because I'm interested in the streets, like the
Yeah.
rock musicians,
Yeah.
and so actually, back to Jesus. Well, first of all, to the left brain, right brain thing, and even Pascal, the genius of Polanyi is that he says, look, where the math belongs is at the subsidiary. So he talks about destructive analysis, which would be a reverting to fixate on what you ought to be subsidiarily indwelling. Like on a bike, if you were revert to fixate on your foot on the pedal,
Right.
well, you see, that's the end of the performance,
Right. Well,
right?
my favorite example of that are free throw shooters in basketball.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
way to make a free throw shooter miss is get them thinking.
right. Right, exactly, exactly. But it's not it's more the from to,
Yes.
and that really actually frees the finesse. So the problem, I say the problem with modernity is a knowledge as information mindset. That's what I
Yes.
call it in Little Manual for Knowing.
Yep.
And the problem with is not information. The problem is information as a philosophical paradigm.
Yes.
So the problem is philosophical.
Yes.
So, science experiments are great, but they're not meant to be philosophical paradigms. That's what I say. Now, back to Jesus. My feeling was, as I got on board with what Polanyi was saying, it exactly went with the Bible in a way that the what I had inherited epistemologically simply didn't go. So once you're on board with this, it's all over the place.
Yeah.
I mean, Jesus, I've been thinking repeatedly about Jesus and the Samaritan woman. His subversive act of showing up at the place where the renewal of the covenant happened by Joshua, and saying, "I am the living water," sitting down, claiming that well, and then, saying to the woman, "Oh, you've had five husbands, and the one you have is not your own." As if, look, I'm the seventh husband. That dress doesn't do you justice. You're now caught up in a larger reality, and my epistemology profoundly resonates. The one I've been blessed to grope my way toward. I which the thing about Loving to Know is it's full of 5 million conversations. That's how I've structured them
Yep.
with all these different people that I have integrated.
Yep. Yep. And so again, back to my individual, what makes you you are these people. And you have integrated them. You have brought them into yourself, and that
Mhm.
makes you you. And then, but there's the you that is also scaling with, I mean, right now, you and I are having this conversation. There's the people that are in your life. And so then then we continue to scale. And again, it's all of this knowing each other in the way that you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. By
Well,
the way, when I think of what I am, I often call myself an epistemological therapist.
oh, that's good. Yep.
Because the point of the beginning of the chapter 1 of Loving to Know is, look, it's not going to be more information that fixes your faulty paradigm of knowledge as information. So I couldn't write a textbook. Now,
Well,
how do you write a 500-page book that isn't a textbook? Well, that whole texture thing going
yep.
on in the book, the conversations, I make the point at one point, like you're saying right now, is okay, I had these conversations, right? But your path could have unfolded in other sorts of ways.
So maybe a good question that I have is because I'm there's absolutely no question that your name got brought up fairly early on in the corner because of your work. And then you've been in a few conversations here in the corner because of your work, because you're very much at home in terms of a lot of what this community has been chewing on for a long time. A lot of, give John Vervaeke a lot of credit with his 4 Ps of knowing and his cognitive science and all of that stuff. Can you give, and a difficulty of this is, I think for many people, if they want to live knowing better, what there needs to be something much more akin to an exorcism that has to take place into
Yeah,
them.
yeah. That's the epistemological therapy.
Yes.
And so that's why I like to do workshops. And
Oh,
and so
tell me about
I
your workshops.
well, I I want to teach them subsidiary focal integration. And and that means I identify all the parts of it, which I do way more extensively in longing to know.
Okay.
It happens over. So, if I can, I make like when I taught the course, I made people read longing to know, and then they read loving to know.
Okay.
Well, so but then what people have to do is they have to identify uh, a skill. Skills work very well, as
Yep.
what you and I have already agreed. And then you have to identify the pieces of it, the features of it in the lingo of subsidiary focal integration. And the point is, yeah, you've been doing this all your life. This is how you keep your balance on a bike.
Yep.
And once I can get them seeing that, then like I say, I want to haunt them for the rest of their lives because everything this is the way they do everything. And so then at the end of my course, I'd teach them subsidiary focal integration, teach them covenant epistemology, and then their project, a covenant epistemology project, would be to identify a knowing venture, an act of coming to know that they are going to undertake, and then when they present, what they're going to do is identify all the 5 million features of knowing that we have laid out in longing to know and loving to know. And then see, it used to be the case that in my classes, when I was teaching this as Christian understanding of life, that they're standing up there giving these presentations and they're proving my point
Yep.
that knowing works this way in
Yep.
every field. And it just gets, everybody just gets happier and happier. It's just a wonderful thing. And so that's what I feel like I have to do. And so I see myself as relaying the accents under what they're actually doing so they can see what they're actually doing when they come to know.
Can we talk about the symptomology of the knowing crisis?
The symptomology of the knowing crisis.
So I'm riffing on Vervaeke because he's got the meaning crisis. And I would say what you're really, and Vervaeke's after this too, but you're really pointing out a knowing crisis.
Oh,
That's the crisis. And then my question is, so often what motivates people, so someone, a complete stranger shows up in church sometime before the whole YouTube thing, when that would happen, what would go through my mind is they had a fight with their wife. They drank too much and got caught by their boss. They they they're broke and had to file for bankruptcy. I mean, it's usually a crisis in some way that will drive someone to walk through the door of a church and say, I need help. But because of all of the wonderful little therapeutic things that the church has blessed the world with, therapy, hospitals, all these things that are all downstream from church, church continues to be sort of the bucket where something's wrong and their AA won't fix it and the accountant won't fix it and the hospital won't fix it. And, they need something to fix something, but they're not really sure what this something is that's wrong. And so, maybe church, I'll try that. So I would say that I think we're both agreed that there is a knowing crisis, that our ideas about knowing are off. And because of our assumptions about knowing and our language are about knowing this grammatical context that we live in, because that is off, what are some things that we can point to in the world that people could both say as, yeah, that isn't the way it should be, and maybe have a clue of this isn't the way it should be because people's assumptions about what this word to know means is out of whack.
Well, I think if I'm understanding you, this is what I do in chapter 1 of Loving to Know, is make the point why we need epistemological therapy. So I start, or I always have a like a driving uh, story. And this one's about Bandit, my little bird.
Yep, yep. It's a great story.
And so on page Roman numeral 18, I say, this is covenant knowing. This offers a concrete example of what I want to describe and recommend in this book. You may think that you need no book guidance to know a wild bird. Why you do is the question with which this book begins.
Now,
So,
most of our people haven't read the book. So talk about the bird a little bit because it's a great story.
well, let me get my picture. Hang on
Okay.
just a minute. I still have his picture up on my shelf. So I inherited Bandit from a student. I don't know if you can see this.
Ah, yeah. Cedar Wax Wings are such interesting looking birds.
Aren't they?
They
And
are.
you know, I knew nothing. Well, I inherited this bird, and he couldn't fly, and uh, I couldn't even tell whether his total wing was missing. As it turned out, it was a matter of feathers. And you know, so he spent the summer on my shoulder. Or I learned, you know, that the best thing to do with him was stick a stick where he was, and he happily hopped onto the stick. And I could wave the stick around in the air. He could catch bugs. Cedar Wax Wings eat 80% fruit, 20% insects. I made him a little fruit salad every morning. But I learned by attending to him. And it was the most intimate thing. He'd go to sleep. You know, I'd lie down for a nap and he would be there and he would just put his little bill against my shoulder and go to sleep.
Wow.
But Bandit, you know, birds are very visual, and Cedar Waxwings are group birds. They
Yes.
don't do anything by themselves, you know. So I was his group. I
Yep.
was his group, and he was only at peace if he could see my face, which I thought was a great, you know, spiritual lesson
Yeah.
that in my life. so
Tell me more about
go
tell me more
away.
tell me more about the relationship with the student that you had that got you the bird, because that's really interesting to me. Because part of what I think if we talk about the symptomology of the knowing crisis, a major issue are our institutions, even our Christian institutions, and the kinds of relationships that we have set up between teacher and student. Now, what that story signaled to me was that story, the fact that you got a bird out of a relationship with a student, said a lot to me about you and your classroom and the kind of community of knowing that
Mhm.
your classroom created.
Well, thank you. That was Alan Cooney, who also makes a little cameo in Longing to Know, and we were having lunch. Yeah, we were having lunch, and I was hearing about this. I could tell you the whole story, but it would take
So,
a little bit
well,
longer.
the thing with YouTube is we do have time, so we love stories here. Because again, I am convinced that the symptomology of the knowing crisis is our inability to value stories properly, even though we as a culture do value stories, but academically we don't.
Okay, so I want to say I feel like the story thing doesn't always help us
Mm,
because it kind of sidetracks that the problem is epistemological. Because, if you put a story in Polanyian terms, a story is a temporal pattern, a
Yes.
temporal integrative pattern. But stories themselves aren't do it. But actually, I think a better picture is face-to-face encounter.
Yes.
So, I mean, you and I looking at each other right now, you're not looking in my eyes. You don't see me looking in your eyes. But if we were face-to-face
Yeah.
and we were looking into each other's eyes, you can't do that and not be changed.
Right.
And see, stories can sound like, well, I'll tell my little tale and you tell your little tale. But encounter is, like Buber said, it's being addressed by the other. It's I, you.
Mm-hmm.
And you you love this as a pastor, I know, because it's that intimate facial communion that changes people.
Yep.
And
Yep.
Bandit and I mean, it was a bird. And part of my point, a big part of my point is knowing isn't just about other people. It's about birds and gardens and even China. I mean, not the place, but the dishes. It's like ordinary dumb objects. It's about knowing them too. And I'm saying it needs to be person-like.
Mm-hmm.
It needs to be person-like. So it needs to be encounter-esque. Well, stories can kind of get in the way of that. People, it's kind of, and story doesn't exactly give us the epistemology that we need. Once we have the epistemology that we need, then we can understand how stories work, epistemologically. But we got to fix the epistemology.
Are you saying that stories give a false sense of knowing?
No, I'm saying you can have a story and not have encounter.
Oh, yes, yes. I would agree with that. I would agree with
And
that.
sometimes the storytelling can get in the way of encounter, actually. I was a part of, I talk about this page 453 in here about John Stanley, who now thinks the whole book is about him. But, he founded this listening evangelism cafe. And in the volunteer training, you were trained to listen, which means shut the heck up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And don't match their story with yours.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you're tempted to, bite your tongue.
Yeah.
So do you see why I'm a little
Don't apologize. Don't apologize. I'm absolutely fine.
okay.
Well, and
Actually, here's a story. Part of the volunteer training at Uncommon Grounds Cafe in Aliquippa was acting out the gospel story of the woman with the flow of blood. And most of the people who were volunteering would be the disciples. And then somebody would be Jesus, and then there'd be this woman. And the woman secretly got coached. And the one I was a part of, it was this woman a little bit older than I from my church. She was the woman, and she did this fantastic job. And so when it was acted out, she walks into the room. Jesus says, "Who touched me?" And the disciples are grumbling. She threw herself down on the ground and she just started screaming, just screaming out of her pain. Well, what Jesus did was keep the disciples quiet to listen. Ergo, shut up.
Yep.
So, and that was transformative for everybody. Which will make somebody want to say, look, the best philosophy gets done in the theater, which is actually what D.C. Schindler is saying about Plato's Republic, is they had to be dialogues. The good comes, and it's Socrates.
So
reality shows up. Reality shows up, walks into the room, as Newbegin says about Jesus. That's how you know you've made contact with reality. You just got taken over.
So we talked about the symptomology of the knowing crisis. Let's talk about the um, what the resolution of the knowing crisis looks like in terms that people value.
Well, I would say that the cool thing is that once you relay the accents so you can see what you're actually doing when you know, modernity is actually dispelled. It just evaporates. You cannot be a baseball outfielder if you've got a defective modernist epistemology. You couldn't do it. Do you want to play baseball? Fix your epistemology.
What does it say that, well, let me say it this way. How badly are we messing up people where the fact is, so I had for a while in my church a pro baseball player, and he was in the major leagues for a little while. He grew up in this church. Um, he eventually became a probation officer, which I thought was probably, I would say, being a probation officer and being a professional baseball player in terms of your ability to know, you really have to have a sense of knowing if you're going to do both of those
Yeah,
jobs.
yeah, right. Situational
Because
awareness.
that's right, situational awareness. Because if there's anything you have to deal with if you're a probation officer is people lying to you all the time,
Right.
because that tends to be what happens. What?
Was he a pitcher?
No, he wasn't a pitcher. He was an outfielder.
Oh,
He was actually in. It was remember there was a movie Angels in the Outfield that was out a number of years ago. He was actually in that movie. He was
oh yeah, very
because they had
cool.
gotten a bunch of AAA ball players to be
Aw.
the Angels in that movie. But
So your question is how badly are we messing people up?
we are messing people up really badly. I know this. And so my wife is a Waldorf elementary ed teacher. I don't know how
Waldorf.
much you know about Waldorf methods.
All I can think of is a salad.
Okay, yeah, Rudolf Steiner. So I know a lot of people are going to kind of, but I mean, at least part of what
I
I
think, yeah, never mind. Go ahead.
anyway. So I think as a culture, we are doing serious damage to people. And part of what I have done in my channel is listen to a lot of stories from people because that's what you do as a pastor is you bring people into the room and you let them talk. And one of the things that they don't I don't know why they never taught us that at seminary. Maybe they couldn't because of how seminary tries to teach people things. But one of the things I eventually learned as a pastor
On that
was
too.
what's that?
I got a texture on that in here too, on seminary.
One of the things that you finally learn as a pastor is one of the most important things you can do for people is just simply to listen to them
Mhm.
because
Listening makes the real, which is what John said. Active listening. Gene Genlin says people don't even have a story till you listen to it. And what I learned from John at the cafe is people have a false story, and I reckon I likened it to like a pump, an old fashioned pump that you got to keep pumping until the water runs clean. And then what John would say is at that point, people save themselves.
yes. Oh, they do. They do. They find well, I mean, psychology figured this out a while ago, but seems to keep forgetting it too. I mean, the talking cure was all about the fact that people needed to talk and to talk and to talk and to talk and to get stuff out. And I love that image of you keep pumping until the water comes clean. And I think that's very, very true. So why I know why I know why schools keep doing what they're doing, and I know why professional education keeps doing what it's doing.
Yeah.
And I guess again, my
We've got to subvert it all the time. We do. We have to subvert it. Subversion. It's got to be subversion. And I love the word disarm, just being disarming, because I love the double meaning. It's like you know, people just throwing down their arms because it's so much better. That's what I like.
so you're
And
so you're retired now, correct?
Well, I quit the teaching job so I could just do the one job of writing. So yeah,
Okay.
yes, I'm emeritus, but I write.
Well, talk to me about writing versus doing workshops.
Well, that's good. Writing for me is my act of coming to know. It's my act of philosophical discovery. And it's I feel morally obligated. Like this is what God called me to do. And in lingo, like Bible lingo, I guess I think it's a prophetic blessing of the nations. And this is what I'm called to do. And then, what happens is hopefully I can follow the books to talk to people. But often what happens is people can have read the books and they read it in the defective mode,
Right.
which
Well,
is collecting information. And then what happens is I show up and things start to happen. So I think I in my body somehow am a catalyst. And usually what happens is that if I have enough time, is people around me start dancing, because it puts so much together. It puts people together. And I when I like that Calvin seminar, oh my gosh, heaven opened and blessings came down. But part of what I do is I really think hospitality is my obligation as a professor. And part of that is I am obligated to make sure everybody's introduced to everybody and has a chance to talk to them. So I'm continually messing with them. I'm putting them at different groups, different tables, different places in the room. I'm making them walk around. I just, it's crazy. Here's another thing I did. My father always, if you had done something heroic, he would pin you with $1. It was a hero medal. Well, I happen to have enough hero medals with dollars. And so every day that somebody had completed their reading, I pinned them with a hero medal. So then they're running around with dollars on their chest. So you see, it's the party approach to a classroom. And that dynamic just it was I felt like it was this subversive enacting. And I have to confess I am a party animal. And in the last chapter of Doorway to Artistry, I argue that we are all the party animal. Humans were made to feast. But see, party invites reality to come. I've got this great quote that I have in there. This is from Julia Cameron. Says, in my experience, the universe falls in with worthy plans, and most especially with festive and expansive ones. In From Robert Speyman. This is from his Education as an Introduction to Reality. He's a philosopher. In celebration, we experience reality in its most real form. That's philosophy. He's a German philosopher.
well, that's a good thing, and of course the Bible sort of points to that because I mean the eschaton is the wedding banquet of the Lamb, and it's not the factory. It's not the factory, which to me is points to part of the symptomology of the knowing crisis because people would imagine that the eschaton is a factory
Yeah, yeah.
where
Just
the es
to that in leisure and the basis as the basis of culture. The totalizing uh work a day, Arbeit macht frei, the idea that it's always work. And his point is, people in modernity cannot celebrate
yeah.
because it's totalizing. And what you need it for philosophy to do, he says, philosophy pierces the dome of the workaday world. You want to you just break that dome. And wonder does that, philosophy does that, that opens up into a celebrative beauty. Yeah.
So I opened up your website and it's again it looks mostly like a an academic website. You've
Done my
got
engineer daughter.
Ah, okay.
Who is
Um,
also an artist, can I just say?
yeah, yeah. So tell me about how you go. You see, I can when you say you write books, I understand why you write books because that's to a degree why I make videos because a lot of the videos I make are me just trying to know. And so and that's sort of become a part of the culture in this corner because people make YouTube videos because they're trying to know and they're wanting to know and they're talking out loud. And the thing that sort of really surprises me is that anybody at all watches anyone else try to know, which is like,
Yeah, yeah.
because you would think that wouldn't be worth watching, but I first got the idea of it when I realized that because I've got, my kids are obviously younger than I am. That's the way kids work. But someone told me about Twitch, where people were playing video games and people were watching other people play video games. And I thought, what's that about? Playing a video game can be fun. Watching somebody else play a video game, what's that about? And then when Jordan Peterson did his biblical series, I asked the question, I wonder if anybody would watch me watching Jordan Peterson's Genesis series. And I thought, because why not try that? So I did it and people watched. And I thought, well, that's curious. So I kept doing things and people kept watching, but then again, people wanted to talk. And then once people were talking, then they wanted to actually come into real life. So this started with me asking the question, because people watch other people playing video games, would someone watch me watching Jordan Peterson's biblical series? And the answer to that was yes. And then that then provoked conversations between people. And that then provoked a more structured approach to hosting conversations for people, which is estuary for in real life conversations. And that then developed larger gatherings of would the people who are watching each other try to know on YouTube and then talking with each other and listening to each other on YouTube, would those people actually come from around the country and around the world in one place to be together? And the answer for that was also yes.
Hmm. That's
And
lovely.
and what was so
Post
interesting, what's that?
post COVID.
Yes. Well, you
Yeah.
start, and I actually got COVID at like our first major one. But and and then and then the realization was, well, we can get people together to see a high profile speaker to listen to John Vervaeke or Jonathan Peugeot talk, let's say, because they have large audiences. But then my question was, could we get people together just to meet each other from the internet? Or so I keep ratcheting down the conferences to lower and lower and smaller celebrities and seeing if getting them together would also sort of provide the same thing. And part of what has been the outcome of a lot of this, I would say, is healing
That's beautiful.
because what so we just did a conference in Olympia, Washington, which had about 80 people in it, and about half of the conference was plenary time where we had some people on stage talking, but the other half of the conference was estuary time where people were in rooms of 7 to 8 strangers. And so by the end of the conference, they had about a total of 8 to 9 hours of in those rooms with strangers. And the impact was powerful.
Hmm.
People and the main thing I think that estuary actually provides is not so much ideas as we sort of imagine them to be these little Amazon packets or boxes, but actually being seen and being heard.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because the estuary protocol, which is basically the process of what an estuary group does, is even though it's ostensibly about this is when you talk, it's sort of sneaky because what it really tricks people into is you actually have to listen unless you sort of want to get embarrassed. at some
Mhm.
point. And there's no shaming involved. It's just that you have
Right.
to pick somebody else's idea that you found interesting and tell us why you found it interesting. And the underside of that is there will be absolutely nothing interesting about someone else's idea unless, to put it into your nomenclature, you knew something about what came out of their mouth, which meant that you actually got a glimpse of who they are.
Mhm.
So,
Yep, yep. So, how about this? So, watch is a passive word, I would say. But I think uh it's good to listen to two people having a conversation because it invites you in.
hmm,
And then what a conversation does, like your corner of the internet, like you've labeled it, it's a vision of reality. It's a world into which people are invited, and then people, it's like you say, look, this is what's going on in our world. This is the lingo, da 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 da. And now you can play in it, which is kind of what I do in the workshops. And the whole thing just like goes with covenant epistemology. It's welcome to a world. And so that's what I argue in Doorway to Artistry is reality hospitably welcomes us into a world. And that's what you're doing. So I think the whole conversation thing has epistemological underpinnings that are healthy.
that's
And
super.
it's for inviting the real. So the real invites first, I'm arguing, which in Loving to Know, I argued that reality is person-like, therefore we need to invite the real. That's best epistemic practices. But now I'm saying no, reality was there first. Reality shows up in beauty and says, here I am, and is a doorway, opens a door to invite us into its world. And so then our groping to know is hospitable reciprocation or noble courtesy to follow into the hospitable situation in which to start to grow our way into the vision. So I that's how I would render. That's the lingo I would use to render what it is that you're doing.
That makes a lot of sense because for a lot of what we do in this, at least part of what we do in this little corner, is say, what the heck is going on here? Because it sort of started. I mean, first I started having people watch me watch Jordan Peterson's biblical series. And then people started coming, sending me messages, and then I was talking to people. But then I thought, I wonder if anybody would watch me talking to another person online. So then, and these were not celebrities or academics or authors or anything. These were people who were, one person then eventually said, you talk to randos on the internet. And so then these became randos conversations. And so then I began talking to all of these nobodies on the internet who had no visibility at all, and everyone was sort of telling their stories and connecting. And then people started that doing, we were then on Discord servers, and they started doing that with each other on the Discord servers. And part of what has happened is that my channel launched a whole bunch of other channels where everyone was sort of doing what I was doing. And so we have all these other channels where, because I couldn't handle everyone who wanted to talk to me, so then suddenly we had all of these other strangers talking to each other on the internet, and people watch it. And again, I would have said that won't work. People won't watch, but they do.
Well, I guess what I think is Jordan Peterson is this great grand person, and it's really nice to hear somebody else ask him questions.
Yeah.
Right? So I've got this texture in Loving to Know called friendship and learning.
Mm-hmm.
All knowing is knowing with. And I have several examples in here, starting with my Boonie Boys. But what comes to mind is this quote on 268 that I learned from a student who also was doing Hebrew. And so in the rabbinic tradition is the quote from Pirkei Avot, the sayings of the fathers, make thee a master and get thee a companion and judge. So we want both the authoritative guide and the companion learner. Is what it
Hmm.
says on page 268. So persons with whom you are united in learning catalyze that transformation. So, you know, like I said, and I try to suggest this is kind of like a triadic interpersonhood. I love this. I coined this term. You know how we like to talk about coram deo.
Mhm.
Well, I said, mom is also first witness and teacher in every respect. The baby encounters the world and God coram materni.
Yeah.
If first knowledge is knowledge of the personal other, second knowledge is knowledge with the personal other. Now, way back, we were talking about me and what I'm doing in Loving to Know. One of the things that I quote somebody is saying that Buber said was, people have to learn to be addressed by a book.
Hmm.
And that, that's I thowishness with regard to a book. And look, okay, I taught logic for 45 years. I have a star in my crown in heaven because I did that. But I can't help but make an argument. But I go at this in a Polanyian way. It's like I have got to indwell until I can repeat the other person's argument. So I enter indwellingly in, and then the book can address me, and hopefully what I'm doing, if I can then liken what I'm doing to what you're doing with your conversations, is I'm offering this conversation to my readers to get them into it too, and to take it into their own lives.
I didn't. I feel a little bad because I didn't really want to put you on the defensive with respect to writing or writing books. I guess so for a long time I was pastoring and I was doing a
Are
fair
you
amount of
wishing I were on YouTube
what's
instead?
that?
Are you wishing I were on YouTube instead?
Kind of, yeah.
Well,
I
invite. I mean, that you just brought me in. That's
well,
what we're.
yeah, well, that's exactly why I bring you in. And one of the things I don't do hardly at all. I'll say never because I did have Tom Holland and Mary Harrington on. But one of the things I don't do at all is I get a lot of books from publishers. And because the publishers want me to have the author on so I can have a conversation with the author so we can sell the book, which is fine. I mean, that's fine. But what I haven't done with my channel, which is sort of normal YouTube, is to look for high status people, to have a conversation with the high status people, and you just keep working up the status hierarchy. And the reason
Why
I
you're
didn't,
working down it?
what's that?
You're working down it.
I did. And because I found and I don't want to take away from anyone who is actually doing that because it's a fine thing to do because high status people are often worth listening to. They're high status sometimes because they have something good to say and it's helpful. And so that's why everybody sort of pushed them up the hierarchy. But I found it personally a whole lot less fun than talking to some of the same, again, this is all pastor stuff, talking to some of the same people over time
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's
to
great.
actually get to know them over time. And I found that far more interesting. And I
Yeah,
actually found it far more rewarding, satisfying. And I felt I learned more because I mean, the truth is, and I love what you say about the garden or even about this little cedar wax wing, because you can learn more from a tiny little garden in back of your house or
yeah,
from a tiny little bird that will sit on your shoulder than you can piling up PhDs and
yeah,
postdocs.
yeah. I'm with you. It's
And
like
so,
reality doesn't need any hype to be wonderful.
no, no. Usually, what it means is we have to, and again, this is so difficult to articulate because there is so much value in the academy and in that form of study and that discipline. There is value there. I get it. And so I'm not trying to dismiss it.
Especially if you fix your epistemology.
Sure, yes. I mean,
Then you can milk it. The students would say to me, "Well, I have to go to these classes that are all stuck in the defective epistemic default." And I that's when I'd say, "Oh, let me tell you, you can change. You can change it."
yeah.
So then I'd tell them two stories. One about Troy, and the other about a student whose name I can see his face. I can't remember his name, but Troy he's like the student that any teacher would want. He would come to class, and he would, I'm lecturing, so he's like this, kind of leaned over next to his neighbor and saying, "This is awesome. This is awesome. Isn't this awesome? This is so great." Well, I mean, I could have kissed him, but you can subvert it. You can have the people over. You can say, "Hey, let's hang out after the class and talk about this." When I at Covenant Seminary, when I first taught this, those guys stood around for hours after class, working at the board, talking to me, talking to each other, talking to third. They went home, they walked their dogs together, and they were still talking about it. They still get together every year and talk about it.
Yeah.
Right. So in other words, you can subvert the dynamic.
Well,
So
I think your point has everything to do with pastoral education. Because if a pastor is at all, I mean, you sort of, when you get into this job and you go through seminary, partly because you're being formed by often a group of academics, sort of the message that you get is your job is to produce excellent sermons each week that change people.
yeah,
And whereas I don't want people out there preaching shitty sermons, that's not the point. And I'm not saying sermons are bad things, but one of the things that I recognize is that over time, there's a lot of other things that are changing people. And it's
yeah,
usually, and I love what you just said now. I mean, it does begin with mom. I mean, because even though I'm a dad of 5 kids, but as a dad, I was always a little frustrated because it wasn't until like the kids are around for like 6 months until they begin to see me at 6 months, but they saw
yeah,
my wife right away. You
yeah,
know,
yeah.
it's the distance
It's
between the
so
breast and
fair,
the eyes.
right? Yeah, and the same with grandmama. I'm finding out.
Oh yeah, I don't have any yet, and I'm
Can I just point out texture 3 is called Knowing as Transformation, Not Information.
mhm.
Implications for academic and theological curriculum, education, and pedagogy. And it's like, it is egregious. The mismatch of epistemic paradigm is worst with regard to seminary.
It's true.
It's
It's
so
true.
it's so sad. It's just so sad. So, uh, all that joking about seminary as cemetery. Well, people go to seminary because they love Jesus. And that is the epistemic paradigm. That's the epistemic paradigm.
Yeah.
And it's like the guy that built the Taj Mahal, and then the box of his wife's ashes were in the rubble over on the side. You just kind of miss the point. But we don't have a philosophical attunement so that we can even say Jesus is the answer to our epistemology. We don't know how to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Why, besides the fall, why did it get so bad? What is it about the current paradigm that is so captivating to us?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I'm gonna, I'm very simplistic about, modernity, but the fathers of modernity were the masters, were about human mastery of nature. And if you're going to abuse an other, the first thing you do is reduce it to less than other, so that then you can manipulate it and force it and control. So that's why, then if you reduce knowledge to bits of information that you're going to amass and scale and commodify, right? I mean, I think the God of modernity is utility, and that's why it's literally an anti-philosophical philosophy, which is why everybody thinks, oh, well, I'm a nuts and bolts person, I'm not philosophical. So that's why I'm not ever going to run out of a job.
No, I know that you certainly will
Well,
not run out of a job.
you know that in the Reformational tradition we talk about the noetic effects of sin,
Yeah.
and there's always going to be that. But in modernity is a noetic effect of sin, and it's ours. And so if we're going to talk about it, I mean that's really where we in the modern West need to start, and in particular because it's killing us. It's killing us. It's killing mission. It's killing the church. It's killing business.
Well, it's
Somebody
killing
wrote,
medicine.
yeah, somebody wrote to me, years ago and say, look, little manual, every entrepreneur needs to read this so they'll stop committing suicide.
Yeah. 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 Well, in
Because
part, yeah.
anyway,
No,
so
part.
we can't talk at each other, can
No,
we?
no. Well, okay. I've been pestering you with questions for the last hour and a half or so. Is there anything that you wanted to ask, or I mean, it's clear you're a missionary on a mission. But anything you wanted to ask in terms of I don't know, anything that you've run across this morning or saw poking around on the channel.
Well, I love knowing what you're up to. That I'm so glad, and I'm so grateful to be invited into it. And I would ask your, not on this particular conversation per se, but please consider me in the mix, and also please share with me any ideas you can have about forwarding the mission,
Well,
of epistemological therapy, because I guess I feel that's my job. Okay, I'm not brilliant, but I've got this thing that I think God has entrusted to me, and so I need to be faithful to it. That's how I feel.
one
So
one of the other idols we have is downstream of this is in fact the IQ idol. I mean, that is abundantly so part of just swept along with Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke as you begin to see all of this, you begin to learn a whole bunch of psychology along the way, and you begin to understand, okay, what exactly do they mean by IQ? And then the more they talk about it, it's like I'm not sure that's a gift to a lot of people
right.
is their IQ. So, well, I think part of what will possibly happen as a result of you being on my channel is that part of so I mean, I still have a church. And I mean, my life has grown very strange since I got involved in YouTube. But one of the things that I'm thinking about doing are more events using my church. Now, fortunately, my church is small, so the only kinds of events I can do at my church are small events. That's a good discipline for me. But I could very much see someone listening to this, and part of what has arisen as a result of all of this stuff in the corner is more and more people want to do events. So I could very much see someone wanting to have you in for an
Mhm.
event so you could do some of these things with
Yeah,
people.
I love
And
that. Well, and like I said, it does take me time. It takes me at least 1,000 pages of reading, and it takes me some hours with
Not a
somebody.
small book.
You've got longing to know, and then up here is loving to know. You put those together, which
Yeah,
was the
yeah.
system that I find most workable. And
I'll continue my pitch to get you maybe playing more with YouTube. Um, because so again, I was blogging and I'd have some people that'd be coming along me and they'd be like, "Well, why don't you write a book?" And I said to myself, if I wrote a book, because I have a bunch of other pastor friends who wind up writing books because they're successful, so they write books, and then the people of their church buy their book and they give their book away to some of their colleagues. And I thought, if I wrote a book, my mother would probably read it. Maybe the people of my church, they might buy a few copies and pretend like they read it, maybe. But I thought they spend way more of their time watching TV. And I figured YouTube was a lot more like TV. And so, and even though I have been making YouTube videos for about 7 years and I have 30,000 plus subscribers on my channel, still nobody in my church watches anything that I do on YouTube. So I eventually had to abandon that too. And I had to actually start Estuary on Sunday morning at church to get a
whoa,
few people of my church into Estuary. And then they're like, oh, because I kept talking about estuary, and then visitors would come to church, and well, that's Paul and his YouTube stuff. And as long as people in YouTube land
wow.
keep giving money to the church, and but then they went to an estuary meeting because it's tremendously difficult to describe what's going on in those meetings, and then they're like, oh, and then suddenly, they're like, oh yeah, Paul, you should keep doing this. This is important. But it's the job of exorcism, and I don't mean that in the very narrow sense, I mean it in the broadest sense. The job of exorcism is actually a very difficult thing because the truth about human beings is we do love our idols and we cling to them, and it's only until usually some kind of minor or more significant disaster comes into our life that we actually are convinced to let them go.
Mhm.
So, um,
Well, so you're saying to me, uh, you should do more on YouTube.
maybe. Well,
And
if it suits you. I mean, there's another saying I have about YouTube.
here's what suits me. If you go back to my so-called academic website, I have a passive podcast page. It's not
Oh,
labeled that, but there's a pull down that says watch, listen, read.
yes.
Well, so if somebody like this, if you'll send me the link when this is done, I'll post it on my website. So that means other people do the work, which I couldn't do because I'm not a techno person, right? I only have a website because I have an engineer daughter who's an artist also. so so but I feel like I'm going to be blessed by any conversation that somebody invites me in, and I'm going to connect. I'm going to put that on my website. So people come to my website and they do look at those. They do listen to those. And so I feel like I am on YouTube without setting myself up as the interviewer.
No, that's true.
I
And
guess maybe, I'm a little, you might not feel like I'm a backward person, but because of the goofiness of what I'm offering the world, I I've I'm not very I'm very hesitant about kind of like putting myself out there. I'd far rather be invited. So if somebody invites me to speak, then I feel like, look, they've committed and now I'm going to talk. All
well,
right.
you
And
don't know what you don't know the box you just opened with that line, I'll tell you, because
oh,
I've got a whole group of people that are not shy about inviting. So,
okay, good. Well, that's how it seems to me. That's why it was nice to teach classes where people actually paid for the privilege,
yes,
of having
I
them
believe
do
that.
homework.
I
At
believe
Calvin, it
that.
was really nice because that was all endowed. They didn't even have to buy their own books. They just had to buy their plane ticket. So that kudos to Calvin on that score. But if somebody invites me to speak, then I come into my own. And you have to realize now in the CRC, you're a little maybe more advanced than my Baptist and Presbyterian upbringing so far. Because I'm a woman, I'm not necessarily somebody that churches want to hear talk, which is why I never opened
Oh,
my mouth until I was 50.
oh, wow.
I spent my years silent.
Hmm.
So, you know, that's another reason I write books, because it's me kind of sweetly and quietly, they people can engage with me without feeling like I'm a female. Actually, it's better now that I'm older, you know. But I just that's
Yeah.
been a very real dynamic in my life, and it's not.
Mm.
I haven't blamed that on God, because God always thinks outside the box. So even his own boxes, he thinks outside. so so it just that's another thing. If somebody invites me, then I know I'm welcome, and they actually invited me because they want to hear me. Or I put it out in the book. If you don't want to read it, you don't buy the book. You know.
I think one of the things that I've learned, so again, I didn't know anything about YouTube when I started this. Um, I was playing around with it. I saw what was happening around Jordan Peterson, and I had an inkling. When I found Jordan Peterson, I was rereading Neil Postman's "Amusing Ourselves to Death," and so that gave me an inkling that something about Peterson also had to do with YouTube. That there was that YouTube isn't just another form of television, but and I'm still not exactly sure what all it is, but there's something else to this. And then I started making videos, and and then I discovered that YouTube could be used like a party line. So I grew up listening to stories from my grandfather. So my grandfather was in these rural churches, and in these rural churches, there were always these party lines. And everybody in these small towns understood that the dominee, that was the Dutch word for pastor, the dominee has a certain ring, and that's when you pick it up. But everybody also understood that if someone is calling the dominee, so one night, my grandfather decided to play a trick on the town. So it was kind of late at night, and he picked up the phone and he rang his own number. And he knew that there were 16 other connections on that party line. And so he just listened. He could hear click, click, click. These are all the people.
Yeah.
And then when it got to 16, he said, "Well, that's all of you." And he hung up the phone. My grandfather would do it. He was the nicest man you would ever want to meet, but he
Well, in
did
other
have
words, people like listening in.
they do. They like listening in. And the other thing about YouTube is, and this I think is your work is all over with this, your value, people can get a sense, they can get hints of your value by the work that you're doing. But you are far more than just this epistemological mission that you are on.
That's so
And
comforting. Thank you so much.
well, it's true.
It sounds
Because
like I have a life.
that's the crazy thing about unsocial media. We call it social media. It's quite unsocial often, but
Mhm.
the largest, the most successful YouTubers actually have very little to say in the way that we think
Yeah.
things said are important.
Yeah.
And so I'm not saying I'm not again, YouTube is
Oh,
something for people who have little to lose. And I I I had little to lose because of a whole variety of reasons, but that's why I started playing around with it. And what I discovered in terms of how we are using YouTube in this is YouTube can be used to actually develop community.
yeah.
And then
Yeah.
most of what I've
Especially in
learned,
the lockdown.
and the question that I have about books is my impression of books are you pour yourself in. I
Yeah.
mean, it's a massive project to write these books.
It is. And I've written 6 or 7 now, depending on how you count. And I've got a contract on.
And you send them out into the world. And maybe
And
I'm greedy in this way, but do you ever see what the books do?
that is a lovely question. I cherish letters I get that say,
Mm,
"You saved my life." And uh, I cherish times that I'm invited and get to work through stuff with students and heaven's blessings descend. Those, and a single life saves the world entire. It
yes.
just, and I guess I have felt like the outcomes are always the Lord's.
Yeah.
Um, but those mean ever so much. I save all of them. I am uh, I have never thrown out a thank you note in my life. So I tell my children, just open the coffin and throw all the cards in with me because nobody else wants them, but I do. You know,
Mm,
but no, I've got those. If you want, uh, here I have kind of gotten into video stuff thanks to a student who's a film director and a couple other people. But on the website, if you go to Longing to Know, I had a Longing to Know turns 20 bash that I made up because the publisher wouldn't do anything about it. And I made some reels with some like key players with Longing to Know over the years. And they're, what, I don't know, just 10 minutes long or something like that. And those, you hear in those lives that were changed
yeah. Yeah.
because of longing to know or loving to know. And, all it takes is one for that to be of infinite value. So, yeah, I guess that's what you're raising is humbling, but I think what you're off saying is wouldn't YouTube be faster? And I guess I have to say yes, maybe, but I don't know. It just it's not an overnight fix. And
No,
what's
that's
more,
true.
even if it were, these books are the story of my quest.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
like it's me in these
Yeah.
books,
Yeah.
and it's like me. This is my love of God.
Yeah.
And isn't that what it's about? It's just this quest is my communion with him.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter if anybody reads it. I just feel obligated. I got to work this stuff out.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I get it. I get it. I get it. So I don't want in any way put any pressure on you. What I am going to say is that you are going to receive invitations. I know that. So
Thank you.
hopefully they'll probably drop my name, and so you'll know when they come. And the other another thing is YouTube isn't exactly what we think it is, and I still haven't figured out what exactly it is. And so keep that in mind when the invitations come. And the way this little corner is using YouTube is not content delivery. So my favorite professor in seminary was, or one of my favorite professors was a guy named Marion Snapper. And he had started his career. Did you know him? You
No,
might not
but
have
it's
heard
a
of him.
wonderful
He had
name.
started his career as an elementary school teacher. And of course, the Christian Reformed Church has all these Christian day schools. So he started in that. And then he was teaching education. And then someone at the seminary said, these pastors, they have to do a lot of education. Maybe we should bring in someone here who knows something about education. So they brought this guy in. And this guy, he was a piece of work in so many different ways. And I could tell a lot of stories about him, but he would always he would complain about basically mug to jug communication, which was from my mug to your jug. And it just drove him crazy because, of course, that was the dominant paradigm. And a lot of people imagine that's what YouTube is. It's mug to jug. Here's all the content. So a book is a content delivery system. And the thing about YouTube is that it opens up this broader canvas
Yeah, yeah. And it's
where,
embedding the real together. It's like
yes,
jazz ensemble.
yeah, it's a little bit closer. It's not there, it's not in real life, but it's a little closer. The third thing I wanted to say is why you are important in this strange ecosystem called this little corner is because of John Vervaeke's story and his history and where he's at in terms of, let's say, his own religious profile.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people will not listen to John
Mm-hmm.
because of where that whole thing is at.
Yeah.
But what's helpful about you for, and you know this because of the people from whence you've come and that you've lived most of your life around, for many of those people, the only signal that they have that they can sort of open the trust doors a little bit is if someone is sort of the right kind of Christian who can say things like, Jesus died for my sins, Jesus rose from the
Yeah.
dead, who can sort of say the Apostles' Creed without sort of squirming or
Right.
kvetching or anything like that. And so, what's really important about you is your your message is very similar and analogous to a part of John's message on
Mm-hmm.
this. And John has been really helping people with their their knowing crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And Christians have sort of felt a little odd about that
Mm-hmm.
because what does that mean about Jesus if
Yeah. Yeah.
John Vervaeke is helping me? And where you sort of fit in is you're in your mission, and at least part of John's mission is very much in the same way, and people can listen to you and sort of have other things sort of settle down in them so that they hopefully can
Yeah.
hear you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's a really important piece in this strange little ecology of this little
Now,
corner.
except I totally appreciate that. Thank you so much. Don't forget my gender.
Yeah. And, if I did edit videos, I would edit that piece because suddenly you sort of triggered a lot of people who want to talk about that in the church. So,
And I
and being,
don't. I have zero soapbox about gender. I just don't. I'm a person. I teach people.
well, part of, I think, a corollary to your mission is an item which should say almost everything that we think we know things aren't really exactly that. They keep going deeper. So
Hmm.
Karen Wong at the event that we did in Olympia, Washington, she was talking to someone, and Karen is a great example of this because she doesn't have a theology degree. She was active in politics for a while, but anybody who listens to her channel knows she is getting into some really deep stuff. And she talked to someone, I really have to memorize exactly how this went, but she talked to someone who said, you don't really know the world until you bump into something in the world that you begin to realize it has no bottom.
Mm. Like a
And like one person they bumped into, it was hair. And and you think hair, I got hair. There's no bottom to knowing hair. And another person was paint. You think paint? And
yeah.
you realize there's no bottom to
Yeah.
knowing paint. And what this actually, and again, I'll invoke a little bit of, my formal training. What this does actually is sort of open a door that Augustine opened, which said that actually it is all about the order of our loves because God made this world so rich
Hmm.
that if you love paint, if you keep going drilling down into paint, you will
Yeah.
find God. And it's like,
Oh.
and that's exactly what creation is about.
Let me commend Doorway to Artistry, where I finally feel like I've done a responsible job in figuring out how I know. So now I can finally start to love reality. So now I call myself an exuberant realist. But so in Doorway to Artistry is attuning your philosophy to enhance your creativity, and so that has to do with our views of reality and our views of how we know. And so this is my first time to do metaphysics, which is what I'm calling a metaphysics childhood, but it's just classical Christian metaphysics, and I feel like it's the doctrine of creation. So I talk about the ising of things.
Hmm.
So, in other words, things showing up. The most remarkable thing about you is that you're here,
Yes.
right? I mean, it's utterly astounding. Well, that just is the Lord's let there being. It's his ising. And there's nothing underneath. It's just ising. And so
There's nothing
essay,
and everything underneath.
honest rendered essay or existence, the heart of metaphysics, literally the main act. So I'm saying it's like a fountain. It's this fountain of lively ising where reality shows up and says, here I am. Here I am. And it's like I can't get over Genesis 1:1. Right? That's just the most astounding thing. And so the first study chapter is about essay, and then in the study the next day, where I talk about this, my Aunt Lorraine's pedestal dish, China pedestal dish, um, I talk about everyday jewels of the real. So things, the primacy of things, I capitalize things with a T, and this is subversive of the reductivism of reality, right? So things, ordinary things, are everyday jewels of the real, and the glinting facets are, oh, guess what? The transcendentals.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
beauty, goodness, and truth, but also thing is the first transcendental, and then something, right? And then relatedness, and then all those kinds of things. So I'm doing plain old, like I finally got a chance to study a little bit of classical Christian metaphysics after all my years in analytic philosophy, you know. And I'm just saying, look, this is astounding, and it just is the doctrine of creation. So Michael Hanby says that the primacy of things is distinctively at home only in a classical Christian vision.
Hmm. I think that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And part of what for me was super helpful in in getting me on the road to this was actually eschatology
Yeah.
and the vision of the new heavens and the new earth and the resurrection.
Yeah. Which
Because
is
Jesus
the
comes,
renewal of all things.
yes, it's the renewal of all things. And it's, he comes out of he doesn't show up as a ghost, he has a
Yeah,
body and he
that's
eats a
right.
fish. And this sort
Yeah.
of began putting me on this track
Yeah.
that's that led there. So anyway, I don't think this will be the last time we talk.
Oh, thank you. I've
Don't
loved
think
it so
so.
much.
I don't
And
think so.
let's
And
do it. Let's do it again.
I
And
think,
you might just be able to write a little something, or give me a tiny little clip of this, and we'll put it on my website.
oh, you don't know what door you've opened. Um, you don't
Well, you
know.
certainly can make it onto my passive podcast page. Just
I
send me
I will. Well, what I'm going to do is what I have on my channel is I eventually had I to be a good YouTuber would mean making way fewer videos a year and having them absolutely polished and perfect.
Well,
That's
nobody's
not me.
in that. I
That's no
mean,
fun at all. It's
The whole YouTube phenomenon is unedited.
exactly.
That's like, what?
So
It's a zeitgeisty phenomenon. It is.
so
We
what I'm
love.
going to do is right after this video is going to get compiled and I put it in my no wait, no ads membership section where certain people who want to support this for like $7 a month, they're all going to get to see it because I also actually started that because when people find out I talked to someone, they're like, they want to see the video right away. But it's like, so then I'm going to make some clips of this and I'm going to put those out on the channel. And then probably in a number of days, 4 or 5 days or so, I'll put the whole video out there. So, and
Awesome.
then I will send that to you and you can do with it as you wish. But
Thank you.
what's going to happen is there are going to be people who want to talk to you. And so is the best way for them to get in contact with you through your website?
Yeah, there's a contact there.
Okay.
And then there's other fun stuff like those reels.
All right. Well, I will make sure that the link is below in the notes and people will contact you. And again, I think probably part of what will happen is I think at some point, because part of what this little corner is eventually creating more and more events, we're probably going to have to get you to some of our events because I think giving you a chance to do what you do in person is probably way better than just watching you on YouTube. So,
Thank you.
all right.
It's great to know you, Paul.
Oh, it's great to know you too, Esther, and I look forward to whatever the next thing is.
Alrighty, alrighty.
Well, you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.